Anika Devrai, a 23-year-old Indian student chasing her dreams in Los Angeles, and Cameron Holt, a wealthy 47-year-old businessman, living a double life, were bound together by a secret sugar daddy arrangement that spiraled into obsession and ultimately a deadly night that shocked everyone who thought they knew them. Anika Devrai was only 23 years old when she left Mumbai for Los Angeles, carrying with her the weight of her family's expectations and her own dreams of success. She had always been a determined student, known in her hometown for excelling in academics and never letting herself become distracted. When she received her acceptance letter to a prestigious business program in California, it felt like the start of a new life. Her parents, proud and hopeful, sent her abroad with limited savings and an unspoken belief that she would someday return with opportunities that could change their lives. Living in a foreign country was not easy, and Anika quickly realized that the glamorous image she had held of America was far from reality. Rent was expensive, her classes were overwhelming, and her part-time job at a small bookstore barely covered basic expenses. She shared a modest apartment near the university with Leah Serrano, another graduate student, who became her closest companion. Leah saw her as disciplined and reliable, someone who spent most nights studying and who rarely indulged in parties or distraction. On the surface, that was true, but there was another side of Anika's life that Leah and even her family back home knew nothing about. Behind her calm exterior, Anika carried a secret that gnawed at her daily. In her second semester, after months of struggling with bills and the constant stress of survival in Los Angeles, she had made a decision that would change everything. Through a discreet online arrangement site, she connected with a man named Cameron Holt. He was 47 years old, a wealthy businessman who seemed to live in another world altogether. Their agreement was simple at first. Cameron would provide financial support, and in return, Anika would spend time with him. What began as an arrangement soon became something much more complicated, something Anika did not fully know how to escape. At first it felt like a solution. Cameron was generous, paying her rent, covering her tuition shortfalls, and showering her with expensive gifts she would never have been able to afford. He took her to restaurants she had only seen in movies, and for the first time since arriving in Los Angeles, she didn't feel the constant weight of money pressing on her shoulders. Yet there was a darkness beneath the surface. Cameron enjoyed control, and though he never raised his voice in public, his presence always carried an edge of authority. He insisted she keep their relationship secret, reminding her that no one would understand, and that secrecy was part of the thrill. Anika told herself it was temporary. She told herself she would walk away once she graduated and found a stable job, but with every month that passed, Cameron's grip tightened. He was no longer just a benefactor, he had become a figure who hovered over every decision she made. He began to demand more of her time, more than she could reasonably give while balancing school and work. His expensive gifts, once exciting, began to feel like shackles tying her to a life she hadn't chosen freely. Her roommate Leah noticed small changes first. Anika was more withdrawn, spending less time with friends from class, and when her phone buzzed, she would quickly silence it, hiding the screen. Sometimes she would leave late at night and return in the early morning hours, exhausted and avoiding questions. Leah assumed she was seeing someone in secret, maybe a classmate or a man from work. She never imagined the truth, that her roommate was entangled in a relationship with a man almost twice her age, a man who lived in a sprawling mansion while Anika returned to a cramped apartment. There were nights when Anika lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of her double life pressing against her chest. To her family in Mumbai, she sent cheerful messages, carefully staged photos, and reassurances that everything was going perfectly. To Leah, she offered vague excuses, but inside she felt the growing dread that she had made a mistake she could never undo. Cameron's world was intoxicating and dangerous at the same time, and she could already sense that he would never let her go easily. Cameron Holt had always been a man accustomed to power. In the world of business, his reputation was flawless, his charm polished, his name associated with wealth and influence. But in private, the edges of that charm were sharper, his need for control far more visible. When he first met Annika, he had been captivated by her youth, her intelligence, and the way she carried herself with quiet dignity. For him, she was not just a companion, she was something to possess. Over time, what Annika once thought of as generosity began to reveal itself as manipulation. Cameron was no longer satisfied with weekend dinners or occasional outings. He began demanding her time in ways that disrupted her studies, calling her during lectures, showing up unannounced near campus, and expecting her to drop everything for him. It was subtle at first. He would insist she cancel a shift at the bookstore so she could accompany him to a private dinner. He would pressure her to skip study sessions, reminding her that he was providing for her, that she owed him. When she hesitated, he would mask his frustration behind a cold silence that lasted for days. The unspoken message was clear. His support came with strings. Annika felt those strings tightening around her like an invisible net, pulling her deeper into a world where her freedom was shrinking. The changes in her daily life did not go unnoticed. Leah Serrano, who had once admired her roommate's discipline, began to see a different side of her. Annika was more distracted, her textbooks left untouched on the table, her assignments rushed. Some mornings she looked as though she hadn't slept at all, dark circles under her eyes, and a nervous energy in her movements. When Leah casually asked if something was wrong, Annika brushed it off, saying she was simply overwhelmed with classes. Yet the truth was more sinister. She was overwhelmed not only by school, but by the constant surveillance of Cameron. Cameron's obsession began to seep into places it didn't belong. He would ask for details about Leah, about her classmates, about anyone Annika mentioned. He grew jealous if she spent too much time with peers, even if it was purely academic. Once, when she casually mentioned studying with a male student, Cameron's mood shifted instantly. He became cold and distant, sending her messages that bordered on threats, demanding to know every detail of her evening. From that moment, Annika became more cautious with her words, terrified of setting off his temper. Even neighbors began to notice unusual things. On several occasions, Cameron's luxury car was spotted idling outside the apartment complex late at night, the headlights cutting through the darkness, while he sat inside, waiting. He never came to the door, never made his presence known, but the sight of the car lingering for hours was unsettling. One neighbor mentioned it to Leah in passing, assuming it was a harmless admirer. Leah dismissed it at the time, but the image of a stranger watching from the street would later haunt her. Annika's secret weighed heavily on her. She had convinced herself that she could manage Cameron's demands while still holding on to her independence. But as his presence grew more suffocating, she realized how little control she truly had. The gifts he gave her were expensive: jewelry, designer handbags, even cash, but every item felt like a chain, a reminder that her life was no longer her own. She told herself that she needed to endure it until graduation, that once she had her degree and a stable career, she could leave him behind. Yet deep down, she feared that Cameron would never allow her to simply walk away. At night, when she sat in her room with her phone buzzing relentlessly, she felt a strange mixture of guilt and dread. Guilt, because she was hiding the truth from Leah and her family back home. Dread, because she could already sense that Cameron's obsession was becoming something dangerous, something that might consume her entirely. What had once begun as a desperate solution to financial struggles was transforming into a cage she could not escape. And though she tried to ignore the signs, deep inside she knew she was living on borrowed time. On a warm evening in Los Angeles, Annika prepared herself for what she told Leah was a simple study session. She dressed modestly, carrying only her phone and a small purse, and slipped out of the apartment with a calm smile that hid the tension twisting in her chest. Leah didn't suspect anything unusual. Annika often claimed to be busy with classmates, but this time was different. This was the night Cameron had insisted on meeting her, saying they needed to talk seriously. His words had lingered in her mind all day, heavy and ominous. She knew his temper, she knew the intensity in his eyes when he felt ignored, and she sensed something darker waiting in that meeting. When she didn't come back by morning, Leah's unease began to build. At first, she told herself that Annika had probably stayed with friends or at the library, But by midday, when Annika's bed remained untouched and her phone went straight to voicemail, fear set. Leah reached out to classmates, professors, and even the bookstore where she worked, but no one had seen her. By nightfall, Leah contacted the police and reported her missing. It wasn't like Annika to vanish without explanation, and the silence felt unnatural, almost suffocating. For 2 long days, there were no answers. Posters began to appear around campus. Classmates shared her photo online, and Leah found herself questioned repeatedly by officers who asked about Annika's habits, her relationships, and her secrets. Leah could only provide fragments. She knew her roommate had been hiding something, but she didn't know what. Her guilt grew heavier with every hour that passed without news. Then came the discovery. Early one morning, joggers passing through the outskirts of Griffith Park stumbled upon something beneath a shadowed brick. At first, they thought it was discarded clothing, but as they drew closer, the horrifying reality became clear. A young woman's body lay hidden among the brush, her dark hair tangled, her arms showing signs of a desperate struggle. The police were called immediately, and the scene was sealed off as news crews rushed to capture the chaos. Detective Marcus Ellery, a seasoned investigator with years in the homicide division, arrived to oversee the case. The victim was quickly identified as Annika Dev. The discovery sent shockwaves through her university and community. Students who had seen her in class only days earlier now whispered in hushed tones about the dangers of the city, while Leah collapsed into tears upon hearing the confirmation. The autopsy, led by Dr. Elias Rowan, revealed chilling details. Annika had been strangled, the bruises on her neck unmistakable. There were defensive wounds on her arms and hands, clear evidence that she had fought back against her attacker. Her clothes were intact, her jewelry still present, but her purse and phone were missing. It looked deliberate, as if the killer had wanted to silence her voice and erase her connections while leaving behind the image of a young woman robbed of her future. For Detective Ellery, the scene raised immediate questions. Who had last seen her alive? What had led her to such an isolated spot in the middle of the night? And most importantly, who had the motive to kill her? His investigation began with the people closest to her, her roommate, her classmates, her employer at the bookstore. But as he sifted through her life, a shadow began to emerge, a shadow that no one had spoken of before. There were gaps in her story, unexplained absences, and unexplained gifts found in her apartment. A designer handbag tucked in her closet, jewelry far beyond a student's budget, and cash folded neatly in an envelope. These clues suggested a hidden life, one that Leah herself hadn't known about. Slowly, the name Cameron Holt surfaced. His presence in her world was undeniable once detectives traced financial transfers from his accounts to hers. Suddenly, the case was no longer about a missing student found dead. It was about the dangerous connection she had hidden from everyone. And with every step deeper into Cameron's life, the picture of obsession and control became clearer. Yet Cameron himself had disappeared, leaving only silence where answers should have been. Detective Marcus Ellery knew that in cases like these, appearances were often misleading. On the surface, Cameron Holt was a respected businessman with a spotless record, but the evidence he uncovered told a different story. The investigation into Cameron's life began with his mansion in the hills, a sprawling property with gated security and expensive cars lined in the driveway. Yet when police arrived with a warrant, they found the place eerily silent. Cameron was gone, and his absence only deepened the mystery. His assistant claimed he was traveling for business, but his phone records suggested other calls had gone unanswered for days, and his credit card activity stopped abruptly on the night of Annika's disappearance. Inside the mansion, detectives uncovered small but significant traces of the truth. In Cameron's office drawer, there were receipts for cash transfers to Annika's account, amounts that matched the unexplained funds Leah had noticed in her roommate's possession. The files were carefully stored, as though Cameron never thought anyone would come looking. In his private garage, investigators used forensic lights to uncover faint traces of blood that had been hastily cleaned. Though not visible to the naked eye, the smears glowed under the blue light, raising suspicions that something violent had happened. Samples were taken for analysis, but the forensic team knew the cleanup had been deliberate. Detectives also searched through Annika's personal belongings in her apartment, finding more links to Cameron. Expensive jewelry boxes, hidden under her bed, designer clothes still in their shopping bags, and an envelope filled with cash. All of it pointed toward a relationship built on more than just casual encounters. For Leah, the discoveries were shocking. She had suspected her roommate was hiding something, but she never imagined her friend was caught in the grip of such a dangerous arrangement. The reality made her feel guilty, as though she should have pushed harder when she noticed the sign. The digital trail gave investigators their strongest lead. Leah reluctantly turned over screenshots of messages Annika had once shown her. The texts were demanding, filled with possessive language, and one in particular stood out. "We need to talk tonight. No more lies." It had been sent only hours before Annika vanished. The threatening tone revealed Cameron's desperation and hinted at an explosive confrontation. To Detective Ellery, it was the closest thing to a confession he had yet seen, but without Cameron in custody, it was not enough to close the case. The pressure grew as the media swarmed around the story. A young foreign student murdered, a wealthy businessman implicated. It was the kind of case that stirred headlines. Reporters speculated about the sugar daddy arrangement, exposing the darker realities of such relationships. Public opinion turned sharply against Cameron, with neighbors and business associates claiming they had always sensed something controlling in his personality. Still, speculation wasn't evidence, and the detective knew that without a solid link between Cameron and the crime scene, the case might collapse under scrutiny. While sifting through financial records, investigators noticed irregularity. Cameron had withdrawn large amounts of cash in the days leading up to Annika's disappearance. He had also canceled meetings abruptly, leaving his staff confused. A witness came forward claiming to have seen his car near Griffith Park on the night of the murder, parked in an area where it didn't belong. The statement added weight to the theory that Cameron had lured Annika there, but Ellery remained cautious. Witness accounts could be unreliable, and the defense would seize any weakness in the case. Just when it seemed Cameron had disappeared completely, a small breakthrough came. Detectives tracked his credit card usage to a rundown motel outside San Diego, a far cry from the luxury he was used to. The motel staff remembered him well, nervous, disheveled, and insisting on paying in cash. Surveillance footage captured him entering the room alone and not leaving again. The discovery shifted the investigation from a search for a suspect to what would become an unexpected and disturbing revelation. The deeper Ellery dug, the more he realized that Cameron's perfect facade was beginning to crack. The polished image of the successful businessman was gone, replaced by a man cornered by his own secrets. Annika's murder seemed tied not only to obsession, but also to desperation, and the truth about Cameron's disappearance was about to lead the case into even darker territory. The search for Cameron Holt reached its climax when detectives descended on the small rundown motel outside San Diego. The building stood in stark contrast to the world of wealth and prestige Cameron had always occupied. The paint was peeling, the carpets worn thin, and the air heavy with stale smoke. Room 14, the one he had rented under his real name, was silent when police knocked. After forcing the door open, the scene inside left the room heavy with dread. Cameron was slumped in a chair by the window, his body lifeless, the curtains drawn to block the sunlight. On the nightstand beside him was an empty bottle of liquor, and a half-used vial of pills. At first glance, it looked like a textbook suicide. Detectives photographed the scene carefully, but something about the arrangement felt staged. A handwritten note was left on motel stationery. The words were brief and uneven. "She betrayed me. I couldn't let her leave. Now I can't live without her." It read like both a confession and a farewell. To the public, it would be enough to close the case neatly. Annika's killer had admitted his crime and taken his own life out of guilt. But Detective Marcus Ellery had worked too many cases to accept a surface explanation. The autopsy performed by Dr. Elias Rowan added more layers of suspicion. The toxicology report revealed Cameron had ingested a dangerous mix of sedatives and alcohol, but the dosage levels suggested precision rather than recklessness. It was as if the combination had been calculated by someone with knowledge of how to shut down the human body efficiently. The positioning of the glass and the pill bottle also seemed too deliberate, as though they had been placed for effect rather than left behind naturally. Most troubling of all, the handwriting on the note did not match Cameron's signatures found in his business documents. It was similar enough to pass as his in a casual glance, but to an investigator's eye, the discrepancies were clear. These details raised the possibility that Cameron had not chosen to end his life at all. Instead, someone else might have orchestrated the scene to look like a suicide. If that were true, then the story of Annika's murder and Cameron's downfall was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Digging deeper into his financial records, investigators discovered that Cameron's business empire was crumbling behind the glossy surface. His partner, facing enormous debts, stood to gain millions in assets if Cameron were out of the picture. What at first appeared to be a crime of passion might have been exploited by someone who saw an opportunity to remove Cameron permanently while diverting attention toward his supposed guilt. Still, the official story presented to the media was far simpler. Headlines declared Cameron Holt as both the killer and the punished, a man consumed by jealousy who murdered a young woman and then ended his own life. For the grieving community around Annika, it brought a form of closure. Leah Serrano, her devastated roommate, stood at a campus vigil surrounded by candles and photographs, trying to come to terms with the hidden life her friend had lived and the violent end that had claimed her. Students whispered about caution, about the dangers of secrets, about the darkness that can lurk behind wealth and charm. Detective Ellery, however, was not convinced. He filed the case as solved but marked the folder with a red tag, a personal system he used for cases with unanswered questions. He couldn't shake the feeling that Cameron's death was not the ending, but another carefully constructed lie. The staged handwriting, the precise drug mixture, and the financial motives of those around Cameron all pointed toward a second crime, one designed to bury the truth forever. Annika Devra's story ended in tragedy, a life cut short in a city where she had come to chase her dreams. Cameron Holt's story ended in disgrace, his carefully built empire collapsing in scandal. But beneath those endings, questions remained unresolved, threads left untied. To the public, it was a cautionary tale about secrecy, obsession, and the fatal consequences of power. To Detective Ellery, it was something else entirely, a reminder that the truth often hides in shadows, and that even when a case appears closed, the story may not truly be over.